Chapter 42 of 60 Years in Southern California, 1853 to 1913, by Harris Newmark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 42: The San Francisco Earthquake, 1906 to 1910. On January 1st, 1906, after more than half a century of commercial activity, with some things well done and some poorly enough, during which it has never been my ambition to better myself at the expense of others, I retired from business to enjoy the moderate but sufficient affluence which years of varying fortune had bestowed upon me. Rather early in the morning of April 18th, news was received here of the awful calamity that had befallen San Francisco, and with lightning rapidity the report spread throughout the city. Newspaper and telegraph offices were besieged for particulars as to the earthquake, which, strange to say, while it also affected even San Diego, was scarcely felt here, and within a couple of hours more than 1,000 telegrams were filed at one office alone, although not a single message was despatched. Thousands of agitated tourists and even residents hastened to the railroad stations, fearing further seismic disturbance and danger, and bent on leaving the coast, and soon the stations and trains were so congested that little or nothing could be done with the panic-stricken crowds. Meanwhile, more and more details of the widespread disaster poured in, and Los Angeles began to comprehend how paralyzing to her sister cities must have been the wreck and ruin following first the shaking of the earth, and then the much more serious fires and explosions. Soon, too, refugees from the north commenced flocking into our city, and these thousands, none with complete and few with decent attire, each pleading pathetically for assistance, told the sad tale much more frankly than could the noisy newsboy, with his flaring headlines and shrill, intermittent extra. Long before much information was secured as to just what had happened, public-spirited men and women, some under the banners of regular organizations, some acting independently, moved energetically to afford relief. The newspapers led off with large subscriptions, while the Chamber of Commerce, Board of Trade, and the Merchant and Manufacturers Association swelled the amount. Eventually some $250,000 was raised. At the same time, and within 2 or 3 hours after the terrifying news had first been received, the directors of the Chamber of Commerce met and appointed various committees headed by Francis Quarles Story, a patriotic and indomitable citizen who arrived in 1883, and having the valuable cooperation of Frank Wiggins, who served as secretary, they went actively to work to render the most practical assistance possible. A supply committee, of which M.H. Newmark was chairman, by 5 o'clock the same afternoon had assembled 14 carloads of goods, partly donated and partly sold to the committee at cost, to go by rail, and 9 carloads to go from San Pedro by water. This train full of necessaries was the first relief of its kind that reached San Francisco. Other shipments of supplies followed daily, and with the first relief train went a corps of surgeons, under the chairmanship of Dr. L.M. Powers, health officer, who established a hospital in the Jefferson Square building, treating 2,000 patients in less than 3 weeks. Among the chairmen of the several committees were J.O. Kepfle, J. Baruch, R.W. Burnham, Niles Pease, Perry Widener, John E. Coffin, J.J. Fogarty, W.L. Vail, D.C. McGarvin, W.A. Hamill, F. Edward Gray, Mrs. R.M. Whitney, and D.J. Desmond, while H.B. Gurley, long identified with Frank Wiggins in Chamber of Commerce work, was assistant secretary. In this way was our sister city laid low, but only as it were for a moment. While the flames were yet consuming the old San Francisco, her children were courageously planning the new, and supported by that well-nigh superhuman spirit which community misfortune never fails to inspire, the spirit that transforms weakness into strength, and transmutes, as by an altruistic alchemy, the base metal of eachness into the pure gold of allness, this stricken people built and built, until today, less than a decade after that memorable night, there stands by the Golden Gate a finer and more beautiful city than the one from which it sprang. And as if to emphasize to other natures the fullness of San Francisco's accomplishment, her invincible citizens are now organizing and triumphantly carrying out a great world exposition. One incident of this period of excitement and strain is perhaps worthy of record as evidence of the good fellowship existing between Los Angeles and the prostrate city. On May 2nd, the Executive Committee (Footnote: President M.H. Newmark, First Vice President J.O. Kepfle, Second Vice President C.C. Reynolds, Third Vice President F. W. Braun, Treasurer L. C. Scheller, Secretary Charles Dwight Willard, Directors H. R. Boynton, J. Baruch, P. A. Benjamin, A. Douglas, I. A. Lothian, and D. Vebers.] of the Associated Jobbers passed resolutions discouraging any effort to take advantage of San Francisco's plight, and pledging to help restore her splendid commercial prestige, whereupon Samuel T. Clover made this editorial comment in the Los Angeles Evening News: "We commend the reading of these expressions of kindly goodwill to every pessimist in the country, as an evidence that all commercial honor is not wiped out in this grossly materialistic age. The resolutions as passed are an honor to the Jobbers Association in particular, and a credit to Los Angeles in general. The Evening News desires to felicitate President Newmark and his associates on the lofty attitude they have taken in the exigency. We are proud of them." Among the many who at this time turned their faces toward Los Angeles is Hector Elliott, the versatile curator of the Southwest Museum. Born in France and graduating from the University of Lombardy, Dr. Elliott participated in various important explorations, later settling in San Francisco. Losing in the earthquake and fire everything that he possessed, Elliott came south and took up the quill, first with the Examiner and then the Times. [Footnote: One of Dr. Elliott's most recent accomplishments is a comprehensive bibliography of Arizona, recently published, the result of Dr. J. A. Monk's liberal provision. End footnote.] Mr. and Mrs. M. Kramer, on April 9th, celebrated their golden wedding. Less than a year later, both were dead. Mrs. Kramer passed away on March 5th, 1907, and her husband followed her 2 days later, an unusual dispensation. In July I was seized with an illness which, without doubt, must have precluded the possibility of writing these memoirs had it not been for the unselfish attendance, amounting to real self-sacrifice, of Lionel J. Adams. From that time until now, in fair weather or foul, in good health or ill, Adams uncomplainingly, and indeed cheerfully, has bestowed upon me the tender care that contributed to the prolongation of my life, and affords me peculiar pleasure to record, not only the debt of gratitude that I owe him, and the sincere friendship so long marking our relations, but also his superior character as a man. J. M. Griffith, for years a leading transportation agent and lumber merchant, died here on October 16th. Griffith Avenue is named after him. Just 2 weeks later, William H. Perry passed away, a man of both influence and affluence, but once so poor and tattered that when he arrived in February 1854 he was unable to seek work until he had first obtained on credit some decent clothes. Sometime about 1907, Major Ben C. Truman, both a connoisseur of good wines and an epicure, figured in an animated controversy as to the making of mint julep, the battle waging around the question whether a julep's a julep or not a julep, with the mint added before or after a certain stage in the concocting. In an exceedingly informal manner, at the Westlake Avenue residence of my daughter, Mrs. L. Loeb, my wife and I, on the 24th of March, 1908, celebrated our golden wedding anniversary, the occasion being the more unusual because both the nuptials and silver wedding festivity had occurred in Los Angeles. [Footnote: On July 15, 1915, Mr. and Mrs. S. Lazard celebrated their golden wedding, Mrs. Lazard being the third daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Newmark to enjoy the privilege, almost unique in a single family, and that will become the more remarkable if Mrs. Eugene Meyer, the fourth daughter, and her husband live to commemorate, on the 20th of November, 1917, the 50th anniversary of their marriage. End footnote. Our pleasure on that occasion was intensified by the presence of friends with whom, during most of our married life, we had maintained unbroken the most amicable relations. Many years after spur track switching charges had been abolished throughout other industrial districts of the United States, the Western railroads continued to assess this charge in Los Angeles, to the extent that, as was estimated, our merchants were paying through this tribute alone an amount not less than $250,000 a year. In August 1908, however, or shortly after F. P. Gregson became identified with the Associated Jobbers, suit was filed by M. H. Newmark as president before the Interstate Commerce Commission, and on May 7, 1910, a decision was rendered in favor of local shippers. But unfortunately, this decision was reversed on July 20, 1911, by the Commerce Court. [Footnote: The Supreme Court of the United States, on June 8, 1914, affirmed the decision of the Interstate Commerce Court, and thus was obliterated this very iniquitous charge. End footnote. Joseph P. Loeb and Edward G. Custer, young attorneys, handled the case in a manner recognized among men of their profession as being unusually brilliant, while Gregson brought together a mass of valuable facts. This was probably the most notable of all the cases of its kind in the commercial history of Los Angeles. The other directors at the time the suit was brought were J. O. Kepfley, C. C. Reynolds, F. W. Braun, L. C. Scheller, H. R. Boynton, A. Douglas, D. Vebers, W. H. Joyce, W. E. Hampton, and E. H. Greppen. Not the least interesting step forward in providing Los Angeles with a harbor was the acquisition of a strip of land known as the shoestring, connecting Los Angeles with San Pedro and Wilmington. This practical idea made possible in 1909 the unhampered consolidation of the three places, and before the beginning of April their various civic bodies had been considering the formation of committees to bring this about. On Saturday, April 3rd, the Los Angeles appointees met at the rooms of the Chamber of Commerce for permanent organization. They were William D. Stevens, Mayor of Los Angeles; Stoddard Jess; Homer Hamlin, City Engineer; F. W. Braun; J. A. Anderson, Attorney for the Harbor Commission and ex-member of the Board of Public Works; Leslie R. Hewitt, City Attorney; Frank Simpson; Joseph Scott, President of the Board of Education; M. H. Newmark, President of the Associated Jobbers; J. M. Schneider, President of the Merchants and Manufacturers Association; A. P. Fleming, Secretary of the Harbor Commission; ex-Mayor M. P. Snyder; H. Jeffney; O. E. Farish, President of the Realty Board, and F. J. Hart. Jess was elected president, Fleming secretary, and to the admirable manner in which they conducted the campaign, much of the ultimate success of the movement must be attributed. The delegates from San Pedro and Wilmington refused to go on until the Associated Jobbers had pledged themselves to obtain for the harbor districts, after consolidation was effected, the same freight advantages enjoyed by Los Angeles. This promise was given and fulfilled. Various other pledges were outlined in the committee's report and adopted by the city council, but many of these assurances have not thus far been carried out by the authorities. Then a vigorous campaign was projected, as a result of which both elections, that of Wilmington and Los Angeles on August 5th, and the other of San Pedro and Los Angeles on August 12th, resulted in handsome majorities for consolidation. These substantial victories were fittingly celebrated throughout the consolidated cities, and on February 10, 1910, the port became officially known as Los Angeles Harbor. In April 1906, 100,000 books of the Los Angeles Public Library, then under the administration of Charles F. Loomis, were moved from the City Hall to the Laughlin Building. With the opening of September 1908, the library was again moved by the same librarian, this time to the Hamburger Building. Footnote: on June 1, 1914, the library, directed by Everett R. Perry, who came to Los Angeles in the fall of 1911 from the staff of the New York Public Library, was removed to the Metropolitan Building at the northwest corner of Broadway and Fifth Street, its shelves, a month later, holding 227,894 volumes. End footnote. On the evening of October 11, 1909, I attended a banquet tendered to President Taft by the city of Los Angeles at the Shrine Auditorium. Every honor was shown the distinguished guest, and his stay of 2 or 3 days was devoted to much sightseeing, to say nothing of the patriotic efforts of many politicians whose laudable desire was to whisper in the presidential ear apropos of government employment. The election of George Alexander as mayor on November 10, 1909, was largely responsible for the later success of the Progressive Party, with whose socialistic policies I am not in sympathy. W. C. Mushet, the more acceptable candidate, ran on a ticket endorsed by businessmen organized under the chairmanship of M. H. Newmark, while George A. Smith was the Republican candidate. Alexander's campaign was managed by Meyer Lissner, an arrival of 1896, who had a brief experience as a jeweler before he had turned his attention to law. He possessed much political sagacity, and was therefore quick to turn the Alexander success to the advantage of Hiram Johnson, who was soon elected governor. George N. Black, who came here a child in 1886 and graduated from the Los Angeles High School, later being president of the California State Realty Confederation and grand president of the Independent Order B'nai B'rith of this district, directed Smith's campaign. On January 29, 1910, the citizens of Los Angeles, under the leadership of Max Mayberg, tendered to D. A. Hamburger, chairman, Perry W. Widener, Fred L. Baker, William M. Garland, M. C. Nooner, Dick Ferris, and F. J. Z. Handelar, the committee in charge of the first aviation meet here, a banquet at the Alexandria Hotel. The contest had occurred a few days before at Dominguez Field on a part of the once famous rancho, and to see the aerial antics of the huge man-made birds as they swiftly ascended and descended was no less nerve-wracking, at least to me, than it was interesting. Litigation having established a clear title to the property once held by the 6th District Agricultural Association and the state, the declared owner having agreed to lease the ground to the county and city for 50 years, decisive steps were taken in January 1910 by the Historical Society of Southern California to provide the museum building now such a source of civic pride. Other bodies, including the Fine Arts League, the Southern California Academy of Science, and a branch of the Cooper Ornithological Society, were invited to cooperate, each being promised a place in the park and museum plans, and by the middle of February the supervisors had agreed to vote the necessary building funds. On July 11, 1910, in the presence of a large and representative gathering at Exposition Park, ground was broken for the building, although the cornerstone was not laid until the 10th of December. In the dark hours of the night of April 25, 1910, after an illness of 4 days and almost entirely free from suffering, she who had shared with me the joys and sorrows of over half a century was called to her reward. She passed from this life as she had passed through it, gently and uncomplainingly. I was left in the midst of a gloom that I thought would be forever black, for 6 out of our 11 children had preceded their mother, whose spirit on that night was reunited with theirs. I was soon to find, however, how true it is that "the Lord tempers the wind to the shorn lamb." Common misfortune and common memories made but stronger the tie, always strong, between my children and myself. Time has performed his kindly offices; he has changed the anguish of grief to the solace of recollection, and in assisting me to realize that I was permitted so long and so happy a companionship, he has turned my heart from its first bitterness to lasting gratitude. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of 60 Years in Southern California, 1853 to 1913, by Harris Newmark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Chapter 43, Retrospection. 1910 to 1913. At 1 o'clock in the morning of October 1st, 1910, occurred the most heinous crime in the history of Los Angeles. This was the dynamiting, by the evil element of union labor, of the building and plant of the Los Angeles Times, resulting in the sudden extinction of no less than 20 human lives, and the destruction of the property of the corporation. The tragedy, lamented in obsequies of the most impressive kind ever witnessed in this city, was followed by the construction, on the same site and at the earliest moment, of the present home of the Times. The trial of some of those deemed responsible for this disaster brought to the fore John D. Fredericks, district attorney. Footnote: in 1914, Fredericks was the Republican candidate for the governorship of California. End footnote. In 1900, 1902, 1906, and 1910. Not the least of the many and far-reaching losses entailed through the ruin of this printery was A History of the Medical Profession of Southern California, by Dr. George H. Kress, with an introduction by Dr. Walter Lindley, a work of extended research almost ready for publication. After all such material as could be saved from the ruins had been assembled, an abridged edition of the volume once planned was issued. In strong contrast to this annihilation of man by his brother were the peaceful exercises marking the afternoon of the previous Sunday, June 19th, when the Caspar Cone Hospital on Stevenson Avenue was dedicated, a worthy charity made possible through the munificence several years before of the pioneer after whom the hospital is named. As superintendent of city schools here for 4 years, beginning in 1906, C. E. Moore laid the foundation for that national reputation, which in July 1910 led to his being called as a professor to Yale University. Jacob A. Riis, the famous Danish-American sociologist, who was so instrumental in cleaning up New York's tenement districts, visited Los Angeles for the 4th time on March 10, 1911, lecturing at the Temple Auditorium on "The Battle with the Slum." The City Council having created a harbor board, Mayor George Alexander, in October 1909, appointed Stoddard Jess, Thomas E. Gibbon, and M. H. Newmark as commissioners. In March 1911, at a popular election, the board was made a charter body, and Mayor Alexander reappointed the gentlemen named. Owing, however, to the numerous difficulties thrown in the way of the commissioners in the accomplishment of their work, M. H. Newmark resigned in December 1911, and Stoddard Jess in January 1912, while Thomas E. Gibbon, for many years one of the most formidable advocates of a free harbor, met with such continued obstacles that he was compelled, in the summer of 1912, to withdraw. Having left Los Angeles, as I have said, in 1879, Meyer Jane Newmark made San Francisco his home until December 1894, at which time he returned here and became associated with Caspar Cone. In December 1905 he once more took up his abode in San Francisco, where, on May 10, 1911, he died at the age of 72 years. The first issue of the Los Angeles Tribune, a wide-awake sheet projected by Edwin T. Earle, owner of the Express, appeared on July 4th, flying the banner of the Progressive Party, but making its strongest appeal for support as the first 1-cent morning newspaper on the coast, and a readable journal advocating the moral uplift of the community. Like all the other newspapers of this period, the Tribune was illustrated with photo engravings. In 1911, William R. Hearst, of national newspaper fame, bought the Los Angeles Daily Herald, making it at the same time an evening newspaper, and placing it under the management of Guy B. Barham. The latter had come to Southern California with his father, Richard M. Barham, who, located in 1873 at Anaheim, conducting there the old Planters Hotel. After school was out, Guy did chores. Graduating, he worked for Hippolyte Cahen, the Anaheim merchant. Then he kept books for Eugene Meyer and Company, and in time became Deputy Internal Revenue Collector. For some years he has been a custom house broker, in which activity, in addition to his newspaper work, he is still successfully engaged. The Federal Telegraph Company, which had established itself in Los Angeles in the fall of 1910, inaugurated in July 1911 a wireless service with San Francisco and other coast cities, and just a year later it effected communication with Honolulu, although oddly enough at first, owing to atmospheric conditions, it was necessary to flash all messages across the waste of waters during the night. For some years the giant steel masts erected by the company in the southwestern part of the city have puzzled the passerby. At 3:30 on November 28th, I turned the first spadeful of earth in the breaking of ground for the Jewish Orphans' Home of Southern California. This privilege was accorded to me because, in response to the oft expressed wish of my wife to assist those dependent children bereft of their natural protectors, I had helped in a measure, shortly after her demise, to assure the success of the proposed asylum. 16 years after Colonel Griffith J. Griffith agreeably surprised Los Angeles in the presentation of Griffith Park, his munificent bounty again manifested itself in another Christmas donation, that of $100,000 for the construction of an observatory on Mount Hollywood, the highest point in Griffith Park. Incidental to the making of this gift, due official recognition of the Colonel's large-heartedness was displayed at a public meeting in the City Hall, in which I had the honor of participating. M. A. Newmark and Company in February 1912 removed to their present quarters on Wholesale Street, a building, it may some day be interesting to note, 5 stories high and with a floor space of 130,000 square feet. In common with the rest of the civilized world, Los Angeles on April 15th was electrified with the news of the collision between an iceberg and the great ocean steamer Titanic, which so speedily foundered with her 1,535 helpless souls. For a day or two it was hoped that no one with Los Angeles connections would be numbered among the lost, but fate had decreed that my nephew, Edgar J. Meyer, a son of Mr. and Mrs. Eugene Meyer, should perish. He was one of those who heroically hastened to the aid of the women and children, nor did he rest until he saw his wife and child placed in one of the lifeboats. They were saved, but he went down with other gallant men, among whom I may mention Walter M. Clark, son of J. Ross Clark of this city. Nor can I refrain, while mentioning this awful catastrophe, from alluding to another example of courage and conjugal devotion. Footnote: even while this manuscript is being revised, the name of another Angeleno, that of the lamented A. C. Billick, a self-made man of large accomplishments, who perished on May 7, 1915, in the awful destruction of the Lusitania, is added to the scrolls of the ill-starred. End footnote. Than which, perhaps, neither song nor story portrays one more sublime. As the huge liner was sinking into the dark abyss, one frail woman declined to become the beneficiary of that desperate command, women and children first. The wife of Isidor Strauss, unafraid though face to face with death and eternity, still clung to her loyal husband, refusing even in that terrible moment to leave him. She chose rather to die by his side, and as the Black Sea roared out its chill welcome, it received one who, in the manner of her going, left a precious heritage for all mankind. Through a high school friendship of my son Marco, I came to know quite well one who, though physically handicapped, acquired much international fame. I refer to Homer Lee, a native of Denver who came to Los Angeles in 1890 at the age of 14, studied at the high school, Occidental College, and at Stanford, and then conceived the monumental idea of freeing the Chinese from the despotism of the old Manchurian dynasty. Making his first trip to China in 1900, he took an active part in a revolutionary campaign, and returning to America a lieutenant general and a force in the Chinese Republican Party, he devoted himself to drilling Chinese troops and to literary work. Some of his writings, notably The Valor of Ignorance, when widely translated, bringing him repute as a military strategist. Having married Mrs. Ethel Powers, General Lee, late in 1911, joined Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese leader, and proceeded with him from London to Shanghai, only to arrive there after the revolution had actually started. Even then success was not to crown his labors. During the convention called to establish the republic, General Lee was stricken with paralysis and his public career was at an end. He returned to Southern California, and at Ocean Park on November 1st, 1912, while looking out toward the land that he loved so well, Homer Lee yielded up his soul. He was not destined to see the fulfillment of his dream, but when the people for whom he labored shall some day have established a true democracy, his name will loom large in their history. In December, the Museum of History, Science, and Art, so favorably situated in Exposition Park, was informally opened. Footnote: the formal dedication took place on November 5, 1913. To the public under the scholarly administration of Dr. Frank S. Daggett, who had been appointed director the year previous, and during the few months following, Professor Daggett, backed by the Board of Supervisors, carried forward with such enterprise the excavations of the pits at La Brea Rancho that, before the ornate building was ready to receive the finds, a unique collection of fossils invaluable for the study of California fauna had been assembled. The discovery of these evidences of primeval animal life, already concentrating the attention of the scientific world, may well be regarded with pride by every Southern Californian, while the proper housing here of precious souvenirs recalling those whose lives have contributed so much to making Los Angeles what it was and is, will permanently add to the attractions of the Southland. Pluckily resisting the inroads of an insidious disease, yet cheerful under all the discouraging circumstances, and as deeply interested as ever in the welfare of this community, Charles Dwight Willard has been confined to his home for many months. On my last visit I found him very feeble. Footnote: during the night of January 21st, 1914, Willard died, on the anniversary of his birth. End footnote. Though still fired with a resistless enthusiasm, the power of his mind asserting itself over the flesh in forcible, if quiet, expression. We sat in a comfortable little bower at his home on San Rafael Heights, with Mrs. Willard, his faithful companion, and after he had uttered an earnest desire to see these memoirs published, we chatted about his life and his activities here. Born in Illinois, and graduating from the University of Michigan, an affection of the lungs, brought on by an attack of typhoid fever, induced him in 1888 to come to Los Angeles in search of a milder climate. His first occupation here was to serve as a reporter for the Times, and then for the Morning Herald. In 1891 he was elected Secretary of the Chamber of Commerce, and during the 6 years of his incumbency he raised the membership from 150 to 1,000, at the same time contributing in a powerful manner to the leading part played by this organization in the fight for a free harbor. During that period also, in conjunction with Frank A. Pattee and Harry Brooke, both well-known wielders of the pen, he started the Land of Sunshine, 6 months later taken over by Charles F. Loomis as editor, and in 1902 renamed the Out West magazine. While in 1897 he assumed the management of the Los Angeles Express, from which he resigned 2 years later. In 1892 he organized with others the Municipal League, serving it ever since as either secretary or vice president, and in the same energetic way in which he toiled as secretary of the Associated Jobbers. In his literary capacity, Willard has been equally efficient, being the author of a compact history of Los Angeles, a history of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, the Free Harbor Contest, and a high school textbook on city government, all of which, as well as contributions to the San Francisco Argonaut, have been favorably received by a discerning public. Frank Wiggins's name is considered by many of his friends a synonym for that of the Chamber of Commerce. Like his predecessor, Charles D. Willard, Wiggins came to California for his health, and upon its restoration identified himself with the Chamber of Commerce on September 17, 1889, becoming secretary in 1897. Although ferociously bewhiskered, he is the mildest and best-natured man in town. He has had charge, in all parts of the country, of many exhibits so unique and so successful that he is known from coast to coast. On May 24, 1913, while many thousand people were assembled at Long Beach for a Southern California celebration of Empire Day, one of the worst local catastrophes occurred through the caving in of the defective floor of a crowded dancing pavilion. Medical and police aid were at once dispatched from Los Angeles, but the result of the accident, the death of 40 persons and injury to many more, cast a deep spell over the two cities. Dr. Charles F. Loomis, assisted by other public-spirited men and women of Los Angeles, including Lieutenant General Adna R. Chaffee, footnote, died on November 1, 1914, end footnote, the first president, Joseph Scott, Mrs. Clara B. Burdett, Miss Mary E. Foy, M.H. Newmark, and William Lacey, on the last day of 1907, incorporated the Southwest Museum. Footnote, the present officers are President Dr. Norman Bridge, Vice Presidents Mrs. Clara B. Burdett, Joseph Scott, and J.S. Torrance, Founder Emeritus Charles F. Loomis, Treasurer Stoddard Jess, Curator Hector Elliott, Directors Dr. Norman Bridge, Robert N. Bulla, Mrs. Clara B. Burdett, E. P. Clark, Charles F. Loomis, Dr. J. A. Monk, M. H. Newmark, Joseph Scott, and J. S. Torrance. End footnote. On the 1st of March 1910, Dr. Loomis, celebrating his 51st birthday, conveyed to the museum his priceless collection of Americana. A sightly eminence of 17 acres near Sycamore Grove was secured, and on November 16, 1912, ground was broken with the formalities usual to such events, the first spadeful being turned by Miss Elizabeth Benton Fremont, daughter of the Pathfinder, followed by General Chaffee and Dr. Loomis. An inspiring feature of the day was the raising by Miss Fremont and General Chaffee of the same flag that on August 16, 1842, General Fremont had unfurled on the crest of the Rocky Mountains. On this occasion Henry W. O. Mulvaney presented a certified check for $50,000, the bequest of Mrs. Carrie M. Jones. This auspicious beginning was followed on July 9, 1913, by the pouring of the first concrete. Footnote. On December 6, 1913, the cornerstone for the building already looming large was laid by the Right Reverend Thomas J. Conati, the broad-minded, scholarly, and much respected Bishop of Monterey and Los Angeles, who died on September 18, 1915, and by General Chaffee. End footnote. How broadly and well those have built who planned this much-needed institution may be seen from both the distinguishing architectural features of the structure, including the caracole tower of cement, and the location, one of the most notable occupied by any museum in the United States. Dr. J. A. Monk, an Ohioan to whom I have just referred, has not been in Los Angeles as long as many others, having arrived only in 1892, but he is known among his friends for his charming personality, and among historians and scientists for his splendid collection of Arizoniana. Commenced his first trip to Arizona in 1884, all of which has been given to the Southwest Museum. Among the features of the Southwest Museum is the large square, or so-called Torrance Tower, the funds for which were generously provided by Jared S. Torrance, whose residence in Pasadena dates from 1887. In that year he came from the Empire State, and ever since he has been an active participator in the development of Southern California. The town of Torrance is an example of his enterprise. My 60 years' residence in Los Angeles has been by no means free from the ordinary family cares, vicissitudes, and sorrows, and it seems proper that I should refer to the physicians who, in times of illness, have ministered to the comfort of my home and its inmates. Our first doctor was John S. Griffin, and he continued in that capacity until I left for New York. Shortly before 1873, Dr. Griffin, whose advancing age compelled him to withdraw from general practice, had been calling Dr. Joseph Kurtz into consultation, and it was then that the latter became my family physician. For a short time I consulted Dr. Charles A. H. D. Segethi, a relic of the old school whose nauseating doses were proverbial. And then Dr. John R. Haynes, now well known as an advocate of socialism, who had arrived from Philadelphia in May 1887, assumed the responsibility. Again, a long period elapsed before events caused a change. In the year 1897, my nephew, Dr. Philip Newmark, came to Los Angeles from Berlin and succeeded Dr. Haynes. Notwithstanding these mutations and cares, my friends have often insisted that I am quick and perhaps even sprightly for my age, and have more than once asked to what I attribute this activity and alertness. It is due, I think, first to the inheritance from my parents of a strong constitution, and secondly to the preservation of my health by a moderate, though never over abstemious, manner of living. To begin with, ever since I traveled with my father in Sweden, I have kept my mind healthfully employed, while I have never long deprived myself of rest. I have also always used tobacco and liquor in moderation, and in this connection I can testify that although wine and beer were at the free disposal of my children, they have grown up to use it either most temperately or not at all. This fact I ascribe to liberal views on such subjects, for it has always been my belief that to prohibit is to invite, whereas to furnish a good example, and at the same time to warn, is to ensure rational restriction and limitation. In short, in preparation for a vigorous old age, I have followed as closely as I could the ancient ideal, a sound mind in a sound body. At the age of 19, I came to Los Angeles, and after a lapse of exactly 60 years, that is, on October 21st, 1913, I find myself completing these reminiscences, ruminating on the past and attempting a prophecy for the future. A battle of 80 years with the world cannot, in the nature of human affairs, leave any man or woman unscarred. But I have learned many things, and among them the consolations of philosophy. It would be presumption on my part to make complaint against the inscrutable decrees of that Providence which guides the destinies of us all. I dwell rather on the manifold blessings which have been my lot in this life, the decision of fate which cast my lines in the pleasant places of Southern California, the numerous excellent and estimable friends whom I have met on life's highway, the many years of happiness vouchsafed me to enjoy, and finally whatever degree of success has attended my more serious efforts. When I came, Los Angeles was a sleepy, ambitionless adobe village with very little promise for the future. The messenger of optimism was deemed a dreamer, but time has more than realized the fantasies of those old village oracles, and what they said would some day come to pass in Los Angeles has come and gone, to be succeeded by things much greater still. We possessed, however, even in that distant day, one asset, intangible, it is true, but as invaluable as it was intangible, the spirit properly called Western, but which after all was largely the pith of transferred Eastern enterprise. This characteristic seized upon a vast wilderness, the same which Daniel Webster declared, in the Senate of the United States, unworthy of membership in the sisterhood of states, and within this extensive area it builded great cities, joined its various parts with steel and iron, made great highways out of the once well-nigh impassable cattle paths, and from an elemental existence developed a complex civilization. Nor is there today in all this region a greater or finer city than fair Los Angeles. Many of us saw it grow. None of us foresaw that growth, even from decade to decade. Westward the course of the empire takes its way. When Bishop Berkeley so poetically proclaimed this historic truth, even he could hardly have had in mind the shores of the Pacific. But here we have an empire, and one whose future is glorious. This flourishing city stands, in fact, with its 500,000 or more human beings, and its metropolitan activities, at the threshold of a new era. The operations of nature change so slowly as to show almost no change at all. The Southern California of the coming years will still possess her green hills and vales, her life-giving soil, her fruits, flowers, and grain, and the same sun will shine upon her with the same generous warmth, out of the same blue sky as ever. The affairs of men, on the other hand, change rapidly. After gigantic labor initiated but 10 short years ago, the Panama Canal is dedicated to the use of mankind, and through its crowded waters will come the ships of every nation, bringing to the marts of Los Angeles choice products to be exchanged for our own. For this and other reasons, I believe that Los Angeles is destined to become, in not many years, a world center, prominent in almost every field of human endeavor, and that, as 1900 years ago the humblest Roman, wherever he might find himself, would glow with pride when he said, "I am a Roman," so in the years to come will the son of the metropolis on these shores, wheresoever his travels may take him, be proud to declare, "I am a citizen of Los Angeles." End of chapter 43. End of 60 Years in Southern California, 1853 to 1913, by Harris Newmark.